Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika prana natapada sarojayo yena premanubhutyasha dattam tam Shri Gurum bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashrad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Mura Kelato Vande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdna Nipatyakshito. Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Nama Jayatam Surito Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kulari Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhakta Maj Jai Rachido Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Galai Shila Tahate Na Huido Murachita Jeva Nahi Bhuji Keva Shunite Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Caitanya-carit Krishna upajive priti janibera serariti shunile borohohit shriyatam shriyatam nityam giyatam giyatam mura chintyatam chintyatam bhaktas Caitanya-caritamrta. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Shri Gauranga Maha Prabhu, and his beloved Parshad, an exalted songbird in the inexhaustible sky of Gauralila, Srila Krishna Das Kaviraj Gosvami Pad. Again today we'll resume our discussion of Caitanya-caritamrta, and in particular the Sanatana Shiksha, the chapter on Abhideya, chapter 22, where we are discussing the eligibility for this Abhideya, the eligibility for the path of bhakti, and specifically Uttama bhakti, or Shuddha bhakti as it is spoken of here in the Caritamrita. So in our last discussion we concluded our observance of the comments of Sridhar Swami Pad, Visvanatha Cakravarti Pad, and Baladevi Dibhushan Pad on Krishna's celebrated, ultimate, most confidential advice at the conclusion of the Gita to be of mind fixed on him, to be his bhakta, to be his worshipper, to offer obeisance to him, and so forth. So, the point was stressed that this was regarded as a superlative instruction in the midst of a number of instructions. In other words, Krishna teaches karma yoga, he teaches jnana yoga, he teaches bhakti yoga, he teaches other subparts of these things. He gives numerous types of advice meant for numerous persons, numerous different bearers of eligibility for different things. So what ultimately is one to do? That depends on one's specific eligibility. So today we'll look further at how Sriman Mahaprabhu explains the eligibility for this path of Shuddha Bhakti with reference to this final teaching of Bhagavad Gita and the hermeneutics or the principles involved as to how this a specified or a specific conviction is arrived at. So I've shared the text for today in the box. It should be available there. So I'm starting from Payar 159. So again, this is following Mahaprabhu's introduction to these final statements of the Gita. He says this: Purva agya veda dharma karma yoga gyan sabsadi sheshe agya balavan. His previous orders were observance of Vedic dharma, karma, yoga, and gyan. This final order, that is, the order that he just quoted, that in 1865, made after having decreed all these other observances, is strongest. So by use of this word balavan, or possessed of strength, in this context meaning comparatively greater strength, then there's this choice of words is significant. So we've got some discussion of that in the comments here. So later in the Caritamrta, there's an adage which goes as follows: between an earlier and a later injunction, the latter injunction or the later injunction is strongest. Purva parayor madhye paravidhi balavan. So the same word balavan is used. So the principle stated in this adage is that the principle stated in this adage is one of the rules that determines the relative strength and weakness of various injunctions that govern how sutras applicable in the process of constructing Sanskrit words are meant to be applied. The process of evaluating the relative strength and weakness of such injunctions is known as bala bal bichar, or deliberation on the strong and the weak, or the bala and the abala, that which has strength and that which lacks strength or has less strength, abala. And this methodology of assigning relative strength and weakness to injunctions, such that certain injunctions are understood to override other injunctions, so as to construct a multi-level order of operations, is also frequently used in other fields of knowledge besides Sanskrit grammar, such as Nyaya and Mimamsa. With reference to this methodology, Sriman Mahaprabhu explains in the present Payar that Bhagavan, Sri Krishna, similarly enjoys a number of different practices through the course of Bhagavad Gita. Enjoins, not enjoys. And that there is a relative strength and weakness between them, such that among them there is one all-overriding ultimate practice. By enjoining this ultimate practice at the very end of his instructions, Sri Krishna implies, by means of the principle that a latter injunction is more powerful than an earlier injunction, that his instruction to follow this ultimate practice overrides all the instructions he gives earlier regarding lesser practices. So, for further discussion of this methodology known as Balabal Bichar, you can find significant discussion of it from Jiva Gosvami Pad in the Sarvasambhadani. And there he goes into it. And also for those who study Sanskrit Vyakaran, in the Harinamamrita Vyakaran, you also have a various set of rules that are given for these type of things. There's rules that apply to affixes that are applied exterior to a word versus interior to a word, certain affixes that are applied before and after others, and then he gives a hierarchy of how all these rules are meant to be applied. And also, sometimes the way Sanskrit Vyakaran systems work is that rules that override earlier rules are stated later. And once you say that, then you automatically just have to understand that anything being said later overrides something that it would apply to that was said earlier. And it's not necessarily even said again or spelled out specifically that X overrides Y. You're just expected to apply the principle and then understand that such injunction overrides an earlier injunction. So for those who are studying these things after having gone through a traditional process of studying grammar, then this type of language, it will be very clear what type of thinking is going on here, because typically you won't study these things unless you've already studied grammar in the traditional setting. So when you're already acquainted with this whole methodology, of how to apply sutras, how to understand the relative weakness and strength of different injunctions, then when you hear this point, it's clear as day what the person is talking about. Oh, okay, I know how to do that. In other words, since I can, understand how these words are built, I can understand how there's an internal hierarchy amongst all these different injunctions given in the Gita. So this is the way, or this is the hermeneutic that's being applied to give stress to this final teaching of Krishna in the Gita, by saying that as later injunctions override earlier ones, so also the instruction that he gives at the very end is said to override the earlier ones. So also even in composition of English, they'll often speak about what they call a periodic sentence or a principle of composition, that the feature of the sentence that's the most important or that it conveys the most significant information is best placed at or near the end of the sentence. So from an aesthetic perspective as well as a methodological perspective, this idea of stress to the latter is quite pervasive. So in that way, Mahaprabhu is giving this stress to the teaching for Bhakti Yoga. So now there's a point related to this in the tippani, which is as follows. The purport of these payars is this. The precept of a bhakta of Bhagavan is that Krishna Bhakti alone, as sanctioned by his, that is Sri Krishna's own statements in the Gita Shastra, that is these statements we just discussed in the last class, 1865, 934, the two places where this ultimate, most confidential of all instructions is given, is the foremost sadhana. So there's an internal methodology within the Gita to establish, you could say, theologically why this instruction is the greatest, and then that's being fortified here with a hermeneutic to stress why it is the foremost of all. In other words, Bhagavan it says explicitly that it's the most confidential or the most important, and the manner in which he says it also is in suit with or further fortifies the force with which he's saying that. So the quote precept of a bhakta of Bhagavan, what is the defining or the rule of life, if you will, of a bhakta? It's that Krishna Bhakti is the foremost sadhana. It's the sadhana that is to be performed. In it, there's nothing lacking. There's nothing that you need to add to it to make sure it's complete. It's not in and of itself. It's the best, but it's not complete. No, not like that. Rather, in and of itself, it is entirely complete. But we'll add, an asterisk there, provided that your understanding of it is complete and you practice it as it's meant to be practiced. If you just have some, shallow idea that it's the best and then go about executing that shallow bit and then become, fanatic about the fact that your shallow practice is the supreme, complete execution, then that's where you get into arguments and embarrass yourself socially, maybe without yourself realizing it. Anyway, I'm not going into too much social commentary here. We would just want to stress the idea that yes, it is the all-sufficient supreme sadhana, but that's provided that it's practiced as intended and practiced with an appropriate understanding. The implication of this comment is that bhaktas of Sri Bhagavan have implicit shraddha in the teachings given by Sri Bhagavan in Srimad Bhagavad Gita, which is accepted as the essence of all shastras. And it is these teachings of Sri Bhagavan that constitute the precepts a bhakta lives by and teaches others. Thus, the point made in the tippani that, quote, only a person possessed of shraddha in the precept of a bhakta of Bhagavan is a bearer of eligibility for Krishna Bhakti, amounts to the conclusion that only a person who learns from a bhakta the ultimate advice by Sri Bhagavan in Srimad Bhagavad Gita, and thereby acquires shraddha in that, becomes eligible to follow the path of Krishna Bhakti. In regard to the following payar, the tippani states the following. He describes the bearer of eligibility for Krishna Bhakti. So now we get more specific. So far, we have this idea that the person who's eligible for this path is the person who thinks this path is the supreme sadhana, who has shraddha or conviction in that. But what will then one do with that, and what does it really mean to have shraddha? That's where the discussion goes from here. So, eyagya bole bhaktera shraddha jadi hoy, sarva karma tyag kori se Krishna bhajai. If a bhakta has shraddha in the strength of this final order, then one relinquishes all karma and worships Krishna. The tippani states the following: Krishna bhakti alone is the foremost sadhana. When someone has shraddha in this aforesaid precept of a bhakta of Bhagavan, then one is a bearer of eligibility for bhakti to him. This is the meaning. So the following verse cited to evidence the conclusion that one who acquires shraddha neither needs to nor should continue to follow the path of karma. So what's also to be noted here is that shraddha shapes behavior. In other words, to the extent that actual shraddha is present in someone, there will be behavior in accord with that. So people may, entertain ideas or think that certain ideas are good, but simply adopting an idea or, pledging credence to a doctrine isn't the same as what shraddha is, because, and as we'll see as this conversation goes on, but I'm just noting it here because it's implied in the very first mention of it, that when one actually has conviction in something, one lives by that. In other words, there is a direct correlation between the actual conviction someone has and the actions that they perform. So when someone has this conviction, then they relinquish all karma and worship Krishna. So here, by quote, all karma, specifically what's referred to is all of the duties that one has as a member of the Varnashram society following the karma marg. So all of the duties that one conventionally understands that are incumbent upon one no longer considers those duties incumbent in the same way, and instead considers that worship of Krishna is the one and only, the ultimate duty. But how exactly one will then execute that practice of worship of Krishna will depend also on one's social circumstances and other things, as will come out in the following discussion. So let's look at the praman from the Bhagavatam. And just for reference, this is verse 1129, and it's the verse that immediately follows the verses 7 and 8 of this chapter, which were quoted a few classes back here in this same chapter of the Caitanya-caritamrta. So, Sri Krishna says to Uddhava, one should perform karmas so long as one shall not become disinterested, or shraddha in hearing and so forth of discussion of me shall not come about. So Krishna supports the path of karma. He's saying it is a duty, it is compulsory to perform these karmas, unless and until one acquires shraddha. In gist, this is what is said, but we'll look at how the commentators have explained. So, Sri Sanatana Pad cites the verse under discussion in Hari Bhakti Vilas as one of a number of evidences from the Shastra that illustrates the termination of eligibility for karma for those who have acquired eligibility for bhakti. So in the Hari Bhakti Vilas, when the Bhagavat Bhakti Mahatmya and so forth is being described, what is the greatness, what is the importance of bhakti to Bhagavan, then in the midst of many of the points that he cites to explain that, one of them is this: karma adhikar nirasanatvam, that the adhikar, or the eligibility for karma, is removed by this. So, when one doesn't have the adhikar for bhakti, it's incumbent upon one to perform karma. But when one acquires the adhikar for bhakti, one, in doing so, loses the adhikar for karma. In other words, it's not that you can have both. There's no dual citizenship, so to speak. Once you take this citizenship, you have to renounce the other one, like India. India doesn't allow dual citizenship, right? If you want to be an Indian citizen, you got to give up whatever citizenship you have. So similarly, if you want to be a bhakta, you have to give up the path of karma. You can't just say, oh, I'll be a bhakta and a karmi. No. Once you acquire eligibility, once you actually have conviction in the path of bhakti, then your eligibility for the path of karma is cancelled. But, as we'll get to, does that mean that no one in no case will ever after perform any act of karma? No, it doesn't mean that someone, according to certain social circumstances, may not do that. But, as we'll see, what does it really mean to perform karma? That has to be understood. And that's what's one of the subtleties that's drawn out in these commentaries. So let's look at Sanatana Gosvami's explanation. Quote, on account of the ineligibility for karma of one possessed of bhakti, no fault shall occur even by relinquishing karma. In this way, he describes the greatness of bhakti. Tabat, he speaks this verse. So, in, courts of law, let's say, you're not, held accountable, or you cannot be found guilty for something that it was not your duty to perform. If we go back to, citizenship, if you're a citizen of, if you're not a citizen of India, and then someone says to you, well, you haven't paid tax to the government of India. Well, I'm not a citizen of India. Why would I be expected to pay tax to them? Unless you fall within their jurisdiction, you have no duty to do that. The word adhikar in, modern, Hindi, Bengali, or whatever, it's also a word that is used for jurisdiction. So when you're in the adhikar of India, then you have the duty to pay your taxes to the Indian government. When you're in another country, you have duty to pay taxes to that government. So if you're in one range of jurisdiction, you're not held accountable, you're not at fault for not having paid the dues of someone in a different jurisdiction. Similarly, he's saying that those who have eligibility for bhakti, they don't have eligibility for karma. They're not in the jurisdiction of the karma marg, and therefore, it's not a fault on their part. They're not faulty if they don't then perform the duties that one has who's in that jurisdiction. So this is the point in, plain speech that's being made. So what are these karmas? Karmas, karmani, refers to compulsory or regular nitya karmas and incidental or naimitika karmas. So this would mean the duties in the varnashram society of one's varna and one's ashram, as well as incidental duties that might arise, such as last rites to be performed for a relative, or things to be done in the time of an emergency, or other such things. Things that occur at certain times of year as per the season or certain astrological circumstances, etc. People have, or, receiving uninvited guests, things like this. These will be incidental duties, and there will also be daily duties. Brahmanas would perform, homas and so on and so forth. So yavata means yavat, so long as. One shall not become disinterested means one shall not become disinterested in the results of karma and in enjoyment of the objects of the senses in this world and the next. So there's two different interpretations of this verse, as we'll see. In one context, this na-nirvedyeta refers to someone acquiring adhikar for the path of gyan. That's not the way Sanatana Gosvami is explaining it, but we'll see that comes up in a different commentary. Here, he's saying that it refers also to someone who's eligible for the path of bhakti. So this is also significant because it's showing that a certain degree of virakti, or vairagya, or the absence of material attachment, or material, taste and interest in material pleasures, is part of what makes one eligible for bhakti. And elsewhere, we hear that vairagya is not an limb of bhakti. This is a point stressed in the Sindhu. So this is in consonance with that, in that these attachment to, vishay, or objects of the senses, this is one type of ashuddhi, or impurity of the citta. And as we'll see as our conversation goes on, that the relative degree of one's chitta shuddhi, or relative purity of the psyche, is also an inherent feature of the adhikar for the path of bhakti as per the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. So that we can say is also suggested or alluded to here by Sanatana Gosvami, meaning that to enjoy things of the world is to partake of them. If you're going to take, or you're going to, extract something of the pleasurable side, but you're not going to do anything that's necessary to provide those things, or that's part of the cycle of how they're generated, then that's one type of imbalance that enters the system. So that would be unfitting. In other words, if you're going to enjoy those things, then you have to pay the price for them. But if you're actually detached from them, then you can be excused from participating in the society that produces them. This is the idea. In other words, there's no free lunch. You can't say, oh, I'm a bhakta, I don't have to do anything. But yeah, when you want to feed me all this great food and let me have all these nice things, then of course, no problem. It's not that you can double dip, so to speak. So, one shall not become disinterested means one shall not become disinterested in the results of karma or in the enjoyment of objects of the senses in this world in the next. In other words, really, really, you have to be interested in serving Bhagavan, not just in, some more distant notion of getting your own satisfaction. Moreover, Shraddha means conviction or love, priti. And by the word adi, and so forth, various types of bhakti, such as kirtan, are indicated. So the idea is that when he says mot katha shravanado, that if you have shraddha in shravana, or hearing of this katha about me. So someone might take an unnecessarily literal reading of that and say, okay, if you have shraddha in hearing about Krishna, then you're not eligible for karma, you're a bhakta. But if you have shraddha in worshipping Krishna or in chanting about Krishna, that won't do, because it says hearing here. So to prevent someone from having such a literal sense, then the commentator is saying that this hearing refers to all other varieties of bhakti as well. Take it as the 9 forms, or the numerous others that are described in the Puranas, summarized in the Smritis, etc. So it's really referring to any act of bhakti at all, and that act of all is being alluded to by that which is the one independent and most fundamental of all of them, namely hearing about Bhagavan. So this is the import of the comment. When disinterest in the results of karma has not manifested, or shraddha in hearing and so forth of discussion of me has not manifested, one should act, that is, perform karma, follow the path of karma yoga. So if you don't have this shraddha, if you don't have disinterest in achieving what comes from following the path of karma, then you should follow the path of karma, because you're attached to the results of it. If you want what comes from following that path, then keep following that path. Only give up the path if you're actually not interested in where that path leads you, and you're truly interested in some other destination. This is the meaning. Because of karma's being possessed of a limit on account of the occurrence of abandonment of a means of accomplishment, or sadhana, when the object of accomplishment, that is, purification of the citta, has been accomplished. So, the path of karma, as per the Gita and the Bhagavatam, is not considered a path that's complete in itself, because all of the results that it produces are transient. None of them are an eternal attainment. So karma is rather considered to be an initial process which can lead one either to take up the path of Gyan or the path of Bhakti. Because as per especially the Bhagavat, Kapiladev Bhagavan says that there are only 3 types of yogas, karma, bhakti, and Gyan, and all the things that you might hear are subparts of those. So the karma process is essentially an initial process which is for the purpose of chitta shuddhi, or purification of the mind of the people, such that they can no longer be interested in enjoying the objects of the senses, achieving transient worldly objects. And when they do that, then they become eligible to take up karma or gyan. So this is the point that he's referring to, that it's natural to give up a means when you're no longer interested in the goal that the means leads to. So that's what it's a little bit kind of backwards language, it sounds, but because of karma's being possessed of a limit. In other words, the karma marg isn't necessarily to be considered something that one is incumbent upon you to follow forever or in all circumstances. It has a purpose, it has a destination that it's meant for you to take you to. In the eyes of the less educated, it's a means to achieve whatever they want in their life. And in the eyes of Bhagavan, it's a means of gradually purifying the people of all their attachment to those things that they want in their state of ignorance. So each has a side in it, if you will. And when the purpose of it, from the higher perspective, from the perspective of teaching people or purifying them of their, external attachments, once that process has been completed, then those things become redundant. It's no longer necessary to continue doing them if the purpose that they are meant to fulfill has already been achieved. By the word or, va, the superiority of this position, that is of the latter, Shraddha and discussion of Bhagavan, in comparison to the former, namely disinterest in karma, is indicated, as in Jiva Maishe. So this is a point that a definition of a Mahanta, which is given in those verses of the Bhagavatam, and it was explained by Jiva Gosvami that a Mahanta can be of two types. This is in the Bhakti Sandarbha, the Krama Sandarbha. Can be a Jnani Mahanta or a Bhakta Mahanta. And that in the verse, the initial lines describe the Jnani Mahanta and the later lines describe the Bhakta Mahanta. And typically, something which is of a superior nature is described second after that which is of a lesser or inferior nature. So he's saying as the definition of a Mahanta is explained like that, similarly also the definition here, the description here of a bearer of eligibility is also being described in that same method. So of the two characteristics that are mentioned, the later characteristic is more important and shows a greater degree of eligibility. This is what he's drawing out from the order of the composition in the verse. Relinquishing karma, even when only non-attachment, that is disinterest, has manifested, is appropriate, and is all the more appropriate when hearing and so forth about Bhagavan are manifested as a result of that non-attachment. This is the purport. So he's saying that if someone only has the first aspect of the eligibility, that's also good. In other words, they can also proceed onto the path of bhakti, but they're not as qualified or they're not as far along as the person who's acquired shraddha. In other words, if you're pursuing one goal and then you realize, no, I don't want this goal anymore, then what do? You try to figure out what else you should do. And then you search, and then in the course of searching, you eventually determine, yes, this is the thing that I actually should be doing, and then you do that. So the person here who might be disinterested is in that middle stage where they're no longer interested in following this path, but they're not yet actually convinced or clear what they should do instead. So if they then, if you will, dabble, or they experiment, or they have some, they consider it fitting to engage in some act of bhakti for the sake of having some experience of it, learning about it, seeing what it is, then that's also sufficient grounds for them to act on the path of bhakti. But that doesn't make them as eligible, or that they're not as well positioned to actually perform bhakti as someone who's both disinterested in the goal to be achieved by the path of karma and arrived at conviction in the path of bhakti as being the principal path to the ultimate goal that they have understood to be the purpose, that for which one's life is worth living. So the person who's both disinterested in the other and has conviction in bhakti is more eligible than the person who's disinterested in the other but hasn't yet acquired that type of conviction. So this is the gradation in the eligibility that Sanatana Gosvami is extracting, if you will, from the way that the verse is described, from the way the verse is written. So that was Sanatana Gosvami's commentary. So Jiva Gosvami has a little bit of a different view. So we'll also look at how he's explained this. So he says the following. A question is raised. Well, in this way, that is, over the course of the preceding verses, a prescription of isolated karma, jnana, and bhakti, that is, a set of instructions wherein karma, jnana, and bhakti are described and practiced as independent paths, has been stated. Compulsory, nitya, and incidental naimitic karma, however, is necessary for everyone. So this is a purva paksha. So someone might say, okay, you've explained. There's karma, there's bhakti, there's gyan. Different people do each of these things. But everybody has to do karma. This is compulsory for everyone. Then, if both karma and gyan or bhakti are practiced together, given that karma is necessary for everyone, in the instance of a mixture between karma and gyan or bhakti, how can pure gyan or bhakti be performed? So this is a question. There's these three paths, but everyone has to follow karma. So then you're going to end up either following karma and gyan or karma and bhakti. But now you're talking about giving up the path of karma and only following the path of bhakti. So how is that possible? Don't you have to follow some group of the two? So to explain this point, then this present verse is stated. Thus, expecting this question, he negates eligibility for karma in the case of the two. That is, he negates the eligibility for karma, that the eligibility for karma remains once one has acquired eligibility for gyan or bhakti. Tavat, he speaks this verse. According to the commentary of Sridhar Samipad as well, karmas refers to compulsory and incidental karmas. Therefore, even the fault spoken of in this statement of mine in the Badula Smriti, quote, Shruti and Smriti are verily my orders. One who proceeds transgressing them is a defiler of my orders and my enemy. Even if he is my bhakta, he is not a Vaishnava. Is not present, that is applicable in this case, because of execution of my order. That is, in the case of one who disregards my orders in the Shruti and Smriti Shastras, meant for karma yogis, because one instead follows my order meant specifically for one who has Shraddha in bhakti. And rather, when disinterest or karma have manifested, transgression of my order shall ensue because of execution of that. So here he flips it back on them. In other words, if one follows my orders in the Shruti and Smriti Shastras meant for karma yogis, even after one acquires Shraddha in bhakti, then one actually transgresses my order that is specifically applicable to one's personal eligibility, or adhikar. And that is a fault. Whereas, non-observance of my orders for those with eligibility for karma, when one has eligibility for bhakti, is not a fault, as is explained in the commentary of Sridhar Samipad on Agyayaivam Gunandoshan, another verse in the 11th canto. Quote, one relinquishes all of one's own dharmas by virtue of having eligibility for resignation from such dharmas by virtue of one's firmness in bhakti. So this verse that he's referring to, where Bhagavan says, the Shrutis and the Smritis are my orders. So if you don't follow those, then you break my orders and you're not a Vaishnava. So someone might say, okay, well then if I don't do all this karma, then I'm breaking Bhagavan's order. And then even if I'm a bhakta, he's not accepting me as a Vaishnava. So here he's explaining, no. It's not that this order is meant for everyone. In other words, he's saying that the purpose that Bhagavan has for any of his orders is always specific to a group, a designated group. Every injunction has a limited eligibility. There is no injunction that is universal. This is very important. So every injunction has an intended group for which it is intended. And when one is acting in accord with whatever injunction Bhagavan has given for the group or the jurisdiction that one is in, then you have no fault. Then you're good. But when you're in one group but following the injunction for another, then you have a problem. This is the point he's bringing out. So when you have eligibility for karma, you have to do karma. When you have eligibility for bhakti, then you can do bhakti, and it's no longer incumbent upon you to do karma, and you're not an enemy of Bhagavan for not following his orders to perform karma anymore, because you're actually following his order, which was given here in the Gita, where he says that of all these orders, the final one is the most important, and one who does this actually does everything. So this is how these points are delineated. For some of us who are, not from the Indian context, and even in Indian society in the present day, many of these things may seem immaterial because the Varnashram society is no longer the society and the government of the present circumstances, or the norms of the present circumstances. But in previous centuries, these things were extremely delicate, extremely important, and were, major features of the way the society functioned, and very, very crucial principles for people to feel conviction in living the life of a bhakta and in taking up the path of bhakta and letting go of many principles and practices related to the karma marg that were extremely, ubiquitous in the society. So historically, so to speak, all of this analysis is very, very important and is, a very, very significant contribution of these acaryas to the society in which they lived, to delineate all of these, elements of the Shastra, which for many are impenetrable and difficult to adjust, and give people a comprehensive way of seeing a singularity and a clarity in how they can live their life. So, although it may not seem highly relevant to modern circumstances, it's worth having some degree of acquaintance with how these things are explained. So, we've heard Sanatana Gosvami, we've heard Jiva Gosvami, now we'll look at Cakravarti Pad's Tika, where he adds some important points to what's been said so far. So, quote, "Thus, in this way, the eligibility for karma of a jiva greatly attached to one's caste, specifically, is entirely natural. That, furthermore, lasts up to what? And when will eligibility for gyan, or eligibility for bhakti, come about?" So this is how he frames the discussion. In other words, someone might say, okay, people who are attached to their bodily identity, their social role, they're going to stick to that. They're required to act in accord with that. So how far does that go? And at what point are you authorized to no longer act solely with reference to that bodily identity and social role that you've been cast in? So to explain that, this verse is spoken. Quote, "One shall not become disinterested," means as long as disinterest does not manifest, one's purification of the psyche has occurred just by means of karma. This is the meaning. So as I mentioned, from Bhagavan's perspective, the purpose of the path of karma is to purify people's minds. From the common people, or the ignorance perspective, the purpose of the path of karma is to give them the fulfillment of their desires. Right? But, Krishna, puts a hook on that, with this famous statement, "Karma nevadikare ste ma phaleshu karachana. Ma karma phala heturbur mate sangosta karmani." That your adhikar, I'm citing this verse because it's also on the same topic of adhikar here. Is that he says, your adhikar, what your right is to act, to perform these duties that you have. But ma phaleshu karachana, but never to the results of those duties. In other words, what actually comes from doing these things, you don't have a right over that. You have the responsibility to do it, but you have to be detached from the outcome. Ma karma phala heturbur. Don't be someone whose motivation is only the result of their action. In other words, be someone for whom performing the action itself is the motivation. In other words, see this as your duty and perform it. What comes of the duty? That's another thing. That's not what's motivating you to do it. That's how it becomes, yoga, karma yoga, as opposed to just mere fruitive activity. And mate sangosta karmani. And don't ever become detached from or give up that action, that duty that you have. So he's prescribing this and saying, if you can live like this, you'll acquire so much purification. Because essentially, the main attachment, the main impurity in the mind is desires. That's essentially what the impurity is we want X and therefore we do Y to get it. So he's establishing the system and he's training people how to think in a different way and saying, act, but not just to get the fruit at the, or the carrot at the end of the stick. And by doing that, your mind will be purified. That your ability to, become cognitively detached from these various thoughts and desires that you have within yourself will gradually grow. And that disinterest, that production of purity and disinterestedness, is the value of the whole process. In other words, so many of the activities, they may be relevant to, the upkeep of society, but from a spiritual perspective, there's no grand significance to them. Rather, the significance is that by doing it in this manner, someone's psyche can be purified. So, therefore, he's explaining here that when in the verse it says, one shall not become disinterested, means as long as disinterest does not manifest, one's purification of the psyche has occurred by means of karma. So I'm citing this verse in the Gita as a way of showing how the karma yoga process is a means of effecting chitta shuddhi. So when disinterest has manifested, then as per my statement, the practice of gyan is for the disinterested. One's eligibility is only for gyan and not for karma. This is the purport. So here you can see how Cakravarti Pad is interpreting things differently than the way Sanatana Gosvami interpreted it earlier. He's taking this disinterestedness as a reference specifically to the adhikar for the path of gyan, rather than as an intermediate aspect of the adhikar for bhakti. No problem. Both are applicable, both are relevant. So it's not that there's a contradiction between the two, but it's noteworthy. Similarly, so long as Shraddha produced by the causeless grace of a Mahat has not manifested, one should perform karma. Thus, specifically, prior to one acquiring Shraddha, there is eligibility for karma. But when Shraddha has manifested, then as per my statement in the previous verse, the practice of bhakti of a person who independently becomes possessed of Shraddha in discussion and so forth of me, yet is neither disinterested nor excessively attached, is a grantor of success. One's eligibility is only for bhakti alone and not for karma. This is the purport. This Shraddha, furthermore, is to be known as definitively superlative. So the Shraddha for the adhikar for bhakti, the adhikar for bhakti, he's saying is superior to someone having the adhikar for the path of gyan. So he's also referring to the order and putting some hierarchy between the elements, but he's just contextualizing them slightly differently than the way Sanatana Gosvami did. Furthermore, this Shraddha is to be known only by means of the characteristic of this firm faith. So now we're getting into the specific content of the conviction that makes one eligible for bhakti, and that's where the Caritamrta goes next itself in the discussion. So this is very important from a more practical perspective for someone who's listening to all this to think, okay, I want to follow the path of Mahaprabhu that Mahaprabhu is teaching here. I want to have Shraddha for this path of bhakti. So what is that Shraddha particularly? Here's the way he presents it. Quote, I shall become successful only by means of hearing and so forth of discussion of Bhagavan, and not by means of karma, gyan, and anything else. So to have the conviction that the success of my life will be by this way and not another way, that's the conviction that's required, or that's the conviction that makes one eligible to take up the path. And to be known as produced only by association of such pure bhaktas. So this type of conviction can only be had by having had the association of those who have it. When one comes into the association of bhaktas who have this type of conviction, who are living a life in accord with that conviction, then that conviction can also be acquired for oneself. And then one becomes eligible to follow this path as it's meant to be followed. Just as, kids sometimes, I don't know about other countries, and where I grew up, sometimes kids would play with marbles or pogs or these kind of things, and then they would have games, and you could either play, and then you play with your marbles and they play with their marbles, and then sometimes the marbles go to them or come back to you, and then at the end everybody gives back all their marbles and goes home. That's one way to play. Or the other way to play is they call it playing for keeps. Means you play, and whenever you win, you get that. So you might end up with doubling all your marbles and taking all your friends' marbles, or you might lose all your marbles, or somewhere in between. So this is a more high stakes thing, what they call playing for keeps. So I'm giving a little bit of a colloquial analogy here to say that to truly follow the path of bhakti, you have to play for keeps. In other words, you have to really actually think that this matters, and you have to have the sense that this is the thing that will lead to my success, and if I don't succeed in this, I will fail. In other words, my life is unsuccessful, my life is unfulfilled, my life is a failure if I do not succeed on this path. That is the flip side of this conviction. And we see in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, I'm just going to jump slightly into another topic, when Sanatana Gosvami is speaking about dainya, or humility, then one of the ways that he defines humility, or dainya, as akritartatva, that a sense of one's own unsuccessfulness, or bhakti abhav, a lack of bhakti. So if one actually has this conviction, this path of bhakti is the path that I have to follow, the achievement of pure bhakti is the aim of my life, and then if you're following that but you haven't achieved that, then what do you feel? You feel unsuccessful. You feel that you lack the goal that you're pursuing. If you're on a road trip to some destination and you're not there yet, you're very aware of the fact that you haven't got to the destination yet. You're not like, oh, maybe I'm already there. It's like, no, you're on the road. You're far still. You have so many miles to go. So similarly, when you have this type of conviction, then the flip side of having this conviction is also the tension, or the stress, if you will, of getting to succeed in acting in accord with that conviction, or succeeding in living out that conviction such that it leads to the attainment that one has. So to take up this path and to have that conviction also implies and requires the readiness to welcome and to feel deeply the stress or the unsuccessfulness or the disconcertion that comes with having a resolute aim in one's life and acting to pursue that. And so that shraddha is what makes one eligible for this path. One has to then see, the more the shraddha, the more the conviction, and the more the conviction, the more the feeling of the absence of having achieved the object that one has conviction in will also be felt. So this is a criterion of introspection. To what extent one has conviction? Well, how much does one feel the intensity of the absence of having acted in accord with the path to achieve the object in which one has conviction? This will also be a measurement of the relative degree of shraddha, and that's something that will come in the following payars, is how shraddha exists in a gradation. It's not just, one day you say, okay, I think this now, and that's it, but rather shraddha has, a relative degree of compactness or denseness, or what the word will be used, dridata. So that's where this conversation is also going. So I'm jumping ahead slightly, but just adding this point on while it's on topic. Okay, before we run out of time, I'm just going to add one other point, which Chakravarti Pad gives in another commentary that he writes on this verse, in his commentary on Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. The other comment was from the Sarita Darshini on the Bhagavat. So he adds the following, quote, soft shraddha, or komal shraddha, means, am I in the right place? Yeah. Soft shraddha means able to be broken by other forms of reasoning and other statements from Shastra, but not rather completely broken because of the non-establishment of someone's being a bhakta in such a condition. I feel like this is I think I've lost my space in this file. One sec.
We were in the second paragraph on I guess the 6th out of the 7th pages.
Yeah, okay, sorry. I don't know what happened there. Thank you.
It's a commentary on 1129.
Yeah, exactly. Ah, okay. Here I am. Sorry, I'm just reading off the actual live file, but it's somehow not displaying properly. Okay, I'll just read off the PDF. Sorry. Where did that go? Okay, so he says, sorry, so this is in the same commentary. Somehow this next paragraph, I just ended up somewhere else. So forget that bit about the Sindhu, that comes in a commentary later. Sorry about that. It says, in this regard, if slight performance of karma on the part of bhaktas in the East or elsewhere occurs, even though they are one-pointed, because of force of the appeal of the karmi communities made to those bhaktas to not relinquish their observance of karma, solely as a result of those bhaktas being situated amid a family of karmis, then that is actually non-performance of karma. Because those bhaktas who perform karma in that case, being without shraddha in that is in any such acts of karma that they may perform under such circumstances, as per the statement of Bhagavan in the Gita, quote, an oblation offered, an austerity practiced, and whatever else is done without shraddha is said to be asat, O Arjuna, and that is neither fruitful in this world nor the next. So, what he's saying here is that to truly follow the path of karma is to follow it with the conviction that one has to do this. But if someone doesn't have that conviction, has conviction in the path of bhakti, but only because of becoming socially obligated due to circumstances, acts out the activity without actually the internal conviction in its necessity, then Chakravarti Pad is saying, that's all right. Because if they were to think that it was actually necessary for them, that would slacken the intensity of their conviction in bhakti. And that would be spiritually problematic for them as an aspirant on the path of bhakti. But if their conviction is firm, and it's exclusively out of social circumstance that one performs such and such activity for people who can't understand the path of bhakti, who don't have shraddha in it, who may end up doing ninda of Vaishnavas if such things are, brought to too vividly to their attention, or, such as that. So then, for the sake of what they call loka samgraha, or social cohesion, as Chakravarti Pad puts it in his tika on Jnana Karma and Jnanabritam in the Sindhu commentary, then he says, that's all right. In other words, it's not that 100% one can never again perform such an act, but one won't feel any obligation to do so, one won't have any inclination to do so, but out of social circumstance, should it be necessary for the well-being of society, then one may act it out, but does so without shraddha in it, and therefore it's not even actually doing it, it's just appearing as if one's doing it to other people who are assuming that you might agree with them, even though you don't. So, this is some way of balancing different, attitudes and, things in society. So that was, I'm sure, something that was very real in, this society hundreds of years ago. Anyway, let's finish it off. I've just got a summary here. In summary, it is incumbent upon a person raised in a society and family governed by the Shastra to follow the path of Karma Yoga until one acquires eligibility for the path of Jnana or the path of Bhakti. Once one acquires eligibility for either of these paths, it is then incumbent upon such a person to follow the injunctions given in the Shastra for that specific path, and it becomes a fault for such a person to continue to adhere to the path of karma as one did when one's eligibility was specifically for that. If someone with eligibility for the path of Jnana or Bhakti continues to slightly observe aspects of the path of karma not because one feels obligated to do so, but rather only for the sake of social cohesion, then this is not a fault and not a transgression of Bhagavan's injunctions for those possessed of eligibility for the paths of jnana and bhakti. Bhagavan Sri Krishna's statement in the verse under discussion thus evidences the statement made in the previous payar that a bhakta who has shraddha in Bhagavan's final advice in Sri Gita, that is his instruction to follow the path of bhakti, will relinquish their observance of the compulsory and incidental duties integral to the path of karma, and instead perform worship of Krishna, that is, follow the path of bhakti. Alright, so we're out of time for today, and that concludes the discussion of this verse in the Bhagavad. So I'll leave it at that for today, and in our next discussion we'll look more specifically at Shraddha in more detail, and what this conviction that was alluded to in Chakravarti Pad's commentary will get more clarity on what it means to have conviction in the path of bhakti, and a number of other indicators of having or lacking that conviction. So these, as the conversation goes on, we'll get into many things that are very relevant and practical to the attitude or the psychology of a bhakta on a day in and day out basis as they aspire to follow the path. So I conclude here. If anyone has comments, corrections, questions, or other feedback, please feel free. This is weird. How this came there. Anyway, okay. Oh, I see a hand. Sorry, I didn't see that.
Pranam, Baba.
Pranam.
You mentioned about dual citizenship, then an analogy about non-dual citizenship, and I was wondering, so for these paths, the eligibility for the path is Shraddha, and because Shraddha is a sliding scale, at what point can we say that a person is on the path, this particular path or that particular path, if there's a sliding scale of in terms of faith?
Well, we can say if they have any Shraddha in the path of bhakti, then they're taking to the path of bhakti, but they'll have little in other words, the aptitude that they have to succeed in practicing it is relatively low, and there may be gaps, so to speak, in their understanding or in their behavior. But if they have any sense that, yes, this is with any degree of clarity that this is the path I should follow, not this other one, then that brings them into the category of having Shraddha in the path of bhakti. And then the level of their understanding, the accuracy of their execution, the subtlety of their manner of understanding, all these things will gradually mature from there.
So they cannot be on two paths at the same time.
I mean, in the technical sense of, if you ask someone, like, to get to the center of town, do I turn left or do I turn right? Like, is it north or is it south from here? Then if someone has enough knowledge to say it's north, it's not south. In other words, if someone has enough clarity to say, I have the conviction that the path of bhakti is the path I should follow, not the path of karma. However they acquired that conviction, however deep it is, however strong it is, if that's what their answer is, if they can only give one answer, then, they have Shraddha. It might be not so informed, not so strong, whatever, but if it just comes down to having to say, what do you ultimately believe in? If you have one act to do left in your life, what kind of act are you going to do? And they say, I'm going to do an act of bhakti. Then we can say, okay, then this person has the status of being an adhikari for bhakti, and therefore, as per this technical analysis that we're reading, it's no longer incumbent upon them to follow the duties of the path of karma. But, in a practical context, that they will how quick or to what extent they'll literally may let go of various activities, realistically, it may take time. In other words, especially in society where one might be in a family or a social circumstance where there's a strong degree of obligation or family resistance to not performing such activities, then the strength of that person's conviction may grow slowly. The degree of behavioral change that may come about may also happen slowly, and then from an external observation, you could say that they're a bit mixed up, if you will. They're doing a bit of both. So, these are principles to explain how things work ideally, and then as we all know, the actual life is messy. How accurately and properly and perfectly any specific individual puts all this into action. If we just judge it on that level, then there might appear to be some mixture. It might seem that the person is oscillating or doing both, or so many things may happen in practical cases. But as far as what is ideal and what would be a way of thinking about it that will lead people towards being progressive in their circumstances, that's the thrust of how these comments are given and how these principles are laid out.
Thank you.
All right, well, we can conclude here if that's it. And if we're so blessed, we'll discuss this wonderful topic of Shraddha and the path of bhakti again next week. Vaishnavebhyo namo nama. Jai Guru, Jai Gaur, Jai Jai, Radhe Shyam.
Jai Shri Radhe Shyam.
Thank you so much.